Um, let's open our Bibles to Ecclesiastes, please. We're going to look at Ecclesiastes chapters 11 and 12 tonight. I remember distinctly the first time I read the book of Ecclesiastes. I was probably about 23 or 24 years old, and I was on my break at work eating what was probably a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And I remember being very surprised at what I was reading. Have you had that experience reading the book of Ecclesiastes? The surprise was that this was in the Bible, that it seems kind of shocking to read it on the first go-around, and I wasn't grasping the whole thing the first time I read it. But we just studied it back home not too long ago, and I'd like to share with you some of the thoughts from chapters 11 and 12, the conclusion of the book. This book is providing for us really helpful, practical guidance on living well in a confusing and broken world. And the writer has sought out the meaning of what he calls life under the sun. And now he's getting to his conclusion. Now, we don't have time to talk about chapter 10, but in chapter 10, he teaches us to be wise. But in chapters 11 and 12, he teaches us to be bold, to be joyful, and to be godly. So if you happen to be a note taker, those are going to be our 3 points. To be bold, be joyful, and be godly. Let's look at the first bit together. And if we could kind of summarize the first 6 verses of chapter 11, he seems to be saying, life is uncertain, so be bold. It's better to risk trying and fail than to have never tried at all. That seems to be the message here, and we hope to unpack that. Let's read verses 1 to 6 together, and then we'll go through and talk about it. Verse 1, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7, or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. If a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Well, did you catch all of that? I think that's kind of difficult. So we're going to just work through it, verse by verse. So I think the main point here is much of life is unpredictable, right? He talks about things we don't know. Verse 2, you don't know what disaster may happen on the earth. Verse 6, you don't know which will prosper, this or that. So you don't know a whole lot of stuff in life. Therefore, caution has its place. You got to be cautious. And that's what chapter 10 talks about. But so does enterprise, right? One of the frustrating things about life under the sun is, as he says in chapter 9, time and chance get the better of our best laid plans. So risk is inherent in life. Everyone took a risk in coming here tonight. You know that, don't you? You got in the car. You took a risk in getting here, right? And if there are risks in everything, then what wisdom is teaching us here is it's better to fail in the trying than to never do anything, right? Or than to never start. So verses 1 and 2, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7, or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on the earth. So when he says to cast your bread upon the waters, I think this is a metaphor for spreading out your resources, right? Bread, it could be grain, literally, or it could be, metaphorically, your livelihood, what that grain stood for. So if there was a flood, and you were a farmer, and the planting season was running out, right, and the ground is too wet to really do anything, it's better for the farmer to take the grain and cast the seeds of grain on the water so that maybe when the flood water recedes, the seeds would take root and produce a crop. At least you'd have something, right? There's a chance. And then when he talks about giving a portion, I think he's saying, instead of focusing on yourself, because life is uncertain, I got to look out for number one, right? Instead of focusing on yourself, give generously while you can, because you might be the one who's in need in the future. And this tracks with what we read in the rest of Scripture, doesn't it? Jesus says, whoever loves his life will lose it. In other words, whoever is putting himself first or herself first at the expense of other people, right, they're going to lose their life. So in view of life's uncertainties, we think wrongly. I think at least most of our tendency is to look inward and, again, look out for number one, right? Hold on to my resources, either because in selfishness or in fear. And we think that we're benefiting ourselves by putting ourselves first. But we've got to fight that tendency towards selfishness and be bold, cast your bread upon the waters, and be generous. Give a portion to 7 or to 8. Why should we do that? Because, first of all, that's wise, but God rewards that kind of behavior, doesn't he? Can you think of any passages in your mind that are floating around about this kind of thing? You probably have a couple in mind. How about Deuteronomy chapter 15? Deuteronomy 15 in verse 10. Here's a passage about how to treat those who are poor, especially during the year, the sabbatical year. And God says to the people in verse 10, "You shall give to him," that is the one who is poor, "you shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him, because for this the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake." All right, how about Proverbs 19? Proverbs 19 in verse 17. Just a couple pages back from Ecclesiastes. It says, "Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deeds." And then one more from the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 14. There Jesus talks about, he gives a parable about a banquet. And before he does so, he says in verse 12, Luke 14, verse 12, Jesus gets invited to this banquet, and he responds by saying, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, don't invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and be repaid." Right? He says, "But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." So we think when times are tight or when times are uncertain that there's, being charitable isn't wise. But wisdom is telling us, yes, in fact, it is wise to be charitable in those times. Right? So the wisdom of the farmer is seen in taking this seemingly hopeless situation. There's a flood, there's puddles everywhere, and turning it into a possible profit. Instead of holding on to what he has, he takes the risk in distributing what he has, which actually protects him against unforeseen danger in the future. And where does that come from? That comes from a deep trust in God, that God is going to take care of me. And when we have that trust in God, then we're free to be bold. We're free to be generous people and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And we're free to put other people first. What about verses 3 and 4? If the clouds are full of rain, what do? They empty themselves on the earth. If a tree falls to the south or to the north, what happens? In the place where the tree falls, there it will be. So here are things that are completely out of our control, right? But instead of trying to read the sky or waiting for the perfect time to act, these situations call for firm, decisive action in that moment. So he gives two examples here. Clouds. Do you think the clouds care about your schedule before? No, right? When they're full of rain, then it pours, right? Do you think a tree cares where it falls, if it's going to make you late to work, if it falls over the road? No, it's going to be pulled down wherever gravity is going to take it. So instead of trying to decode what might happen in your life, just our business is to grapple with what actually is, what lies within our reach. People who do great things in their life, they don't wait for the ideal conditions to start. If we waited for the perfect time to start doing the things we ought to be doing, then you'd never accomplish anything. If you never sow a seed, then you can never reap a crop, right? Ask the farmer. These are things he knows. So he who observes the wind will not sow. He who regards the clouds will not reap. What about verse 5? Well, life under the sun is mysterious. It's uncertain. And it begins with the mystery of conception and prenatal growth, right? How does a body formed in the womb of the mother? It's an amazing thing, right? Then we're born into a world that is also full of uncertainty. And then if you live a couple of years on this earth, the more you learn, the more you grow, well, the more complex and confusing you actually realize life is. And the more you find out, the more you realize you don't know, right? So we know that God, Ecclesiastes talks about this in other places, but we know that God has a plan. We just don't really see how all the little pieces fit together, and that's okay. We trust God, right? And then in verse 6, he kind of gives us the summary. The right response to the uncertainties of life is to accept that there's going to be some calculated risks, and you believe that, hey, I know some of my ventures are going to fail, but I know others will succeed. Paul said, redeem the time, because the days are evil. So the preacher expresses it in terms of a farmer and his work. Paul expresses it in terms of a spiritual harvest in places like 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. So how do you apply a text like this today to you? Be bold. The uncertainties of life should motivate us to concern ourselves with the most important things in life. Prioritize your faith. Prioritize your devotion to worship and your relationship with God and daily Bible reading and prayer. Be with God's people. Life is uncertain. You don't know if you're going to be able to get out of bed tomorrow. You don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, right? So take advantage of these opportunities right now, as you guys are doing, right? What about proclaiming the gospel? What about inviting that neighbor over your house and developing that relationship, asking them if they want to study the Bible? Or being generous to others, right? Or treasuring your family right now. You might be putting that on the back burner. You're going to be sorry you did that. What have you got right now? Life is uncertain. You don't know what's going to happen. So be bold and act. So the smallness of our knowledge and the limitations of our control and the likelihood of hard times, those are all reasons to make the most out of your life and be busy with the things which are important. So the call here is to be bold, not in a careless way, right? Not in an irresponsible way. In fact, the most careless, irresponsible thing we could do in life is fail to heed this wisdom and live in a state of paralysis where, uncertainty just, keeps us in check all the time. Like that in the parable of the talents, the guy who was given 1 talent. What did he go and do? He was afraid, so he just went and buried it. So anything worth doing is risky. Life is uncertain, so be bold. All right, let's look at the second half of chapter 11. Again, if we summarize it, life is short, so be joyful. And this is, I think, what struck me as the first time I read this book. It was like Ecclesiastes was saying, like, life is short and brutal and full of pain, and then you die, so you better enjoy it. And there's some truth to that, right? And that's what these verses, I think, are saying. It's better to enjoy life while you have it than wallow in misery all the time. So having dealt with some uncertainties, verses 1 to 6, now he deals with things that are certain. But he lands in the same place. You're to make the most of our short lives, not only with our work, verse 6, but also with fun stuff. You know, life is not all about work. And Ecclesiastes in different places says this. And it's important that we celebrate life and that we enjoy life's pleasures, not as opiates to tranquilize us, but we enjoy life's pleasures as gifts that God has given to us. So life is really serious. And there are a lot of tears, and there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of tension. But it can also be a lot of fun, right? So he presents a balance here in these verses. And each delight, I want you to see this in verses 7 to 10, each delight is confronted with its opposite. And he doesn't soften either one. He shows a very balanced view. For example, joy in relation to life and death. Look at verses 7 and 8. He says, light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So, if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. So, light and dark, he's contrasting here life and death. He's capturing the bliss of being alive and enjoying life with that phrase, life is sweet. You Oregonians probably say that all the time when you are driving through these valleys and you get to see this dense foliage and these beautiful rivers. Life is sweet and the sun is just cresting over the hill. You're so blessed to see that every single day. Life is sweet. But this youthful radiance, it may last for many years. And that's great, but eventually it's going to end. And the light of life will give way to the darkness of death, just as a sunrise is followed by a sunset. Now you've got to face that fact right now and come to grips with that fact right now. Or else, when the time comes, you're going to be shattered by it. You won't be prepared. So because death is certain, which that sounds kind of depressing, right? But it's not. Because death is certain, we ought to enjoy life for however long we possess it. And then joy in relation to right and wrong, verses 9 and 10. Look at verses 9 and 10. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. Now, if you look at verse 9 again, at first glance, that looks like the ultimate killjoy. Have fun, just know that you're going to have to pay for it later, right? I don't think that's what he's saying. That's only true if the joy that we're seeking is a parody of the real thing, right? If it's some kind of wicked pleasure, some kind of sinful pleasure that we're after. So just as the fact of death, as we looked at in verses 7 and 8, taught us to enjoy life while we have it, the fact of judgment teaches us how to enjoy life properly as God intended it. So by living within the moral boundaries God has established, we can get the most out of this life. God's going to evaluate all of our deeds according to his righteous judgment. But because God's commandments and his prohibitions that he gives us in Scripture are only for our good, we're not robbed of any true joy at all. The only thing that we miss out on are its parodies, its perversions, the deceitful pleasures of sin. Jesus came to give us life and that we would have life abundantly, right? So rejoice in your youth. But rejoice responsibly, because youth is not going to last. Again, verse 10, Put away pain from your body. Remove vexation from your heart, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. He's not saying here you got to squeeze some joy out of an otherwise pointless and short life. That's not what he's saying. He's saying you can't stop the aging process. Therefore, to idolize your youth and to dread the loss of youth, that is vanity. So learn to act your age, right? Like all things, youth is beautiful in its time, but it's grotesque beyond it. You've seen older people who are trying to act and dress and look younger than what they are. So remove vexation from your heart, he says. In other words, don't dwell on the bitterness provoked by the disappointments and the problems of life. Don't dwell on those things. Now, it's okay to be a realist. It's okay to recognize that we live in a broken and vexing world. He says so in chapter 7, in verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. It's okay to be a realist, but the disappointments and the brokenness of life, that shouldn't make us pessimists. Life is short. Be joyful. So how, again, can we apply the text? Here's this refreshingly realistic and positive approach to life. Enjoy every day in view of the judgment. And far from stealing any joy, living according to God's Word actually enables us to enjoy life to its fullest extent without the guilt and the pain and the added vexation that sinful pleasure brings our way. Life is hard enough as it is, right? We don't need to add to it with our bad choices. So enjoy it. The brevity of life should motivate us to celebrate God's gifts with thanksgiving. You can add to this list, 1,000 times over. Add to it in your prayers tonight. Anything that you want to put, the salvation that you have there in Jesus, your relationship you have with the Father, the enjoyment that you get from other Christians in this congregation, your family that you have, the blessing that is, your friends, the food that you ate today, the peace you enjoy, wealth and health, and all the things that you have right now. Of course, enjoy those things responsibly. Life is short, so be joyful. How are we doing? You guys okay? We got one more point. All right, let's look at chapter 12. So our third point, life is fragile, so be godly. Life is fragile, so be godly. It's better to commit to God in your youth than wait until old age. So Ecclesiastes talks about vanity, right? Death is the supreme vanity that we all experience, and our age will eventually catch up to us. Therefore, remembering our Creator in the days of our youth is especially important. So the preacher describes the frustrations of old age with a wide variety of metaphors here. Let's just read the first verse and then we'll go on to read the rest here. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Now, we understand when the Bible tells us to remember, it's not just a mental act, like, not forgetting. In the Bible, to forget God is to turn away from God. And to remember God is to commit to Him in loyalty and faithfulness. Again, back to Deuteronomy just real quick here. Deuteronomy 8 in verse 11, talking about when the Israelites get into the promised land, and God is warning them about their attitude when they finally get there. He says in verse 11, take care lest you forget the Lord your God. How? By not keeping His commandments and His rules and His statutes, which I command you today. And also verse 18, further on down, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may confirm His covenant that He swore to your fathers, as it is to this day. So the point is, what is he saying here back in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1? You can't afford to put off faith in God a life of surrender and loyalty and obedience to God until you're older. The best course is to commit to Him at the earliest possible stage, before old age sets in, with all of its difficulties, and the joys of youth are taken away. I'm talking to you young people. That's what verse 1 is saying. Look around you at this congregation. Look up to these older Christians, and you ask them. You ask them what life is like. And I'm sure they would tell you the exact same thing that the Ecclesiastes writer is saying. You commit to Jesus now. Now's the time. Do it while you're young. Right? That's the way of wisdom. Because old age is coming. Old age is coming. And so again, he describes it with a wide variety of metaphors. Verse 2, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. So he talks like the rhythm of life. It's like the seasons. You know, you've got your spring and your summer of youth, but they give way to the clouds and the rain of autumn, middle age, and then the cold and bitter winter of old age sets in. And the images of light and dark reappear from chapter 11 and chapter 1. As darkness closes in, it becomes increasingly harder to throw off the troubles and anxieties of life. And it's not just about the fading of your physical and your mental faculties, which happens, but it's also the loneliness, the loss of friends, the loss of a spouse, the loss of your health, the loss of loved ones, the loss of freedom, like lights blinking out. Our faculties, our friends, our freedoms, they're taken away from us if we live long enough, right? And then what the really tragic and cruel thing about getting old is that all of this happens to a person without the resilience of youth or the prospect of recovery. You know, when you're young, troubles, illnesses, a broken bone, these are minor setbacks. That means you can't go swimming for a couple months or something, you know? You can't spend time with your friends in the summer. They're not disasters. When you're young, you expect the sky to clear, but in old age, we get to a point when we know that there might not be much improvement. And so, verse 3 and 4. In the day when the keepers of the house, the metaphor shifts to talk about your body as a great house that's gone into decline. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dim, and the doors on the street are shut, when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. So in this metaphor of the body as a house, right, the arms and the hands that used to perform the daily tasks, the keepers of the house, they begin to tremble and shake. The strong legs that once carried your body so swiftly, so confidently through that house, those strong men, they begin to weaken, they begin to sag at the knees. You're no longer so steady. The loss of your teeth makes it hard to grind solid food. The windows of your eyes grow dim with blindness. The doors on the street, those are your ears. Right? They grow dull. They leave the house in silence, and the noise of life is shut out, and all we can hear is our own chewing. And all the auditory evidence of a living, bustling world outside grow remote and faint. And one no longer feels as much a part of it as they did when they were in the middle of the tornado of kids running around and this kind of thing. Verse 5, they are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. Maybe not every verse here is metaphorical, right? The older you get, the less you want to fall, right? Because the harder it is to get up. Afraid of being knocked over, being jostled in the streets. The almond tree blossoms. Now in Palestine, trees blossom midwinter, and although the petals of the almond trees are pink at their base, they're white on the tips of the flowers, like the white hair of old age. But unlike the tree, the old person has no future spring in which to enjoy the fruit, right? The grasshopper, this image of youthful vibrance and jumpiness, right? Of vitality, it drags itself along. And desire fails. Desire fails, either the decline of one's sexual vitality or even one's appetite. Either way, what once we possessed, we're going to lose. Why? Because man is going to his eternal home and the mourners go about the streets. Shakespeare wrote in As You Like It, it reminds me a lot of Ecclesiastes chapter 12, of this picture of old age. His big manly voice turning again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all, that ends this strange eventful history, is second childishness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. And then he says in verse 6, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Before, verse 6, the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God, who gave it. A series of images which all speak of the beauty and the fragility of the human body. It is as breakable as a thin silver cord or a clay pitcher. And it's as useless in the end as a broken wooden wheel that can no longer raise and lower the bucket into the well. And when that cord finally snaps, when the pitcher shatters, when the wheel breaks or whatever, that's the moment when our body fails us. And eventually, verse 7, the body is buried. It returns to the ground from which it came, while the spirit returns to God who gave it. What does that remind you of? Genesis 3, right? Genesis 2 and 3. It reminds us of our fall. Because of sin, the body reverts to its own elements. The spirit, which was always God's, to give or to take away, returns to him. And the preacher ends with the refrain that he began the book with. In verse 8, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. Life is a gift of God to be enjoyed. But he reminds us here that life under the sun is fragile. It's fleeting. Now, at the moment, we're all here. We all have energy. We all have life. But it will decay. It will eventually cease in death, the supreme frustration, the supreme vanity. And the point, again, it's not negative. It's positive. Instead of leaving us in despair, these cold, hard facts should drive us to serve God at the earliest possible moment. The fragility of life should motivate us to serve God now. So with these haunting pictures of mortality, we find that initial cry at the beginning of the book. You know, all of life is vanity. It's justified. And nothing in our search for meaning under the sun can lead us home. Nothing we're offered under the sun is ours to keep, not even your own life, your own body. But that's what the preacher is doing. He's backing us in a corner. He's pointing us beyond anything under the sun with the words, your Creator, the one who created, the one who exists distinct from the creation, the one who made the sun, the one who made you. Therefore, while you have life, while you have youth, you have opportunity. And youth is relative, brothers and sisters. If you're here, you've got some. Death hasn't reached us yet. And so let it rattle its chains. Let it stir us into action. Are there important things that you're putting off until you're older? Why would you do that when life is so tragic or so fragile? What about someone who hasn't become a Christian yet And you know that that's what you ought to do, but you're putting it off until a more convenient time. What about you stepping up to serve the church, to get out of the margins of this church family and start involving yourself in the lives of other people? You know that's what you ought to do. You see other people doing it, and you long to be a part of it, but you're just remaining on the margins. Why would you wait when life is so fragile? What about showing hospitality? Inviting someone into your home, starting a Bible study in your community, or getting serious about your prayer life, or just even attending regularly. Why wait? Well, thank you guys so much for listening. I know this is a heavy sermon in a lot of ways, but I actually think it's really positive. And it's meant to shake us up. It's meant to make us think deeply about these things. We ought to, right? We don't want to put it off like the rest of the world. We don't have answers for these things. So life's uncertainty should motivate boldness, not fear. Life's brevity should motivate celebration, not misery. Life's fragility should motivate godliness, not idleness. So verse 13 and 14, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So the preacher in the book has shown all the other pathways come to nothing but vanity. But these dead ends, again, they point us to the one who made us for Himself. In fearing God and doing what He tells us to do, we find our wholeness. We find our all. We find what we were made for. And everything else is empty. Everything else is vain by comparison. When we serve God, it puts everything else into perspective, and we can actually have an ordered kind of life. So this final verse, it drives home the point enough to hurt, doesn't it? And to jolt us out of our complacency. Look, there's going to be a judgment. Nothing goes unnoticed. Nothing goes unassessed. Not even the things we disguise from ourselves. Now that's kind of scary, but at the same time, these words can transform our lives. If God cares this much, then life isn't pointless. And Jesus comes along, and He shows us the way. He shows us the life. He shows us the truth. He is those things. No detail is too small for God to notice. An idle word, the death of a sparrow, 2 mites, a cup of cold water, the repentance of one sinner, every hair on your head. He knows all. So life is uncertain, life is brief, life is extremely fragile. But because of the reality of the resurrection of Jesus and the certainty of judgment, your life matters. What you do matters. The choices you make matter. They have consequences. So live in boldness, live in joy, live in godliness, knowing that someday death will be swallowed up in victory. And nothing we do, if we do it for Him, is wasted, is in vain. Paul uses that word, nothing that we do for the Lord is in vain, right? Almost as an answer to Ecclesiastes. All of life is vanity. Paul says, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Even though it may seem that way, it's not in vain. Somehow, God is able to carry those things over, incorporate them into the future. So, be bold, be joyful, and be godly. Those are the points we want to take home with us tonight. Thank you guys so much, again, for your attention, your kindness. If you need to respond to the gospel, or you need the prayers of this church for any reason or encouragement, and you can come forward as we stand and sing.